Boa noite a todos os presentes e sejam bem-vindos ao 7º Simpósio sobre Migração e Proteção de Pessoas, com a nossa convidada, a professora Kristina Campbell, sob a mediação da professora Tatiana Campbell. Damos início ao primeiro painel do 7º Simpósio sobre Migração e Proteção de Pessoas, passado, presente e futuro, organizado pela Assessoria Jurídica para Migrantes em Situação Irregular ou de Risco, a GESIR, grupo de extensão vinculado ao Grupo de Estudos em Direito Internacional, GEPED. Visto que esse painel será apresentado por uma professora dos Estados Unidos, faremos agora as apresentações em inglês. Good evening to everyone. And welcome to the 7th Symposium on Migration and Protection of People. For this panel, we receive our guest, Professor Kristina Campbell, Professor of Law at the University of District of Columbia, David A. Clark School of Law. Professor Campbell teaches constitutional law, first, administrative law, immigration law seminar, and service learning. Professor Campbell was the foundation director of the Immigration and Human Rights Clinic from 2010 to 2017, and the co-director from 2017 to 2020. This panel will be mediated by Professor Tatiana Campbell, Professor of Undergraduate and Master of Laws at the Federal University of Uberlândia, PhD in International Law from UFRGS, with a sandwich period at the University of Ottawa, Master in Public Law from Unicinos, with a study period at the University of Toronto. Member of AZEGIP, ILA, and ABRI, co-coordinator of the Study and Research Group on International Law, CNPq-UFO. And before giving the floor over to Professor Tatiana Campbell, we remind you that at the end of the presentation, that will be a space for questions and comments from all participants. You will be able to use the YouTube chat to send some comments. Welcome to the 7th Symposium on Migration and the Protection of People, past, present, and future, and we hope you enjoy the event. Now we give the floor to the Professor Tatiana to conduct the panel.
Thank you, Elena, for the presentation. It is a great pleasure to have Professor Kristina Campbell along with us for our 7th Symposium on Migration and Trafficking of People. Professor Kristina, the floor is yours for your presentation. Afterwards, we can talk a little bit more about your points and some of the things that we can maybe share along your scenario and our scenario as well here.
Great. Thank you so much, Professor. Thank you, everybody, for having me here, for inviting me again. I really enjoyed speaking with you last year, and I'm thrilled to be here. I hope someday I can come in person. But for now, this is wonderful. So I'm going to talk a little bit about a thought that I've been having here in the United States. As you know, we have had a great influx of refugee children coming from the U.S. Mexico border. Over the last, for the last maybe, 10 years, it's become quite a crisis. But I think one thing that's interesting about the United States law is that we have our own domestic immigration law that's based on international law, on the international conventions. And I've written an article about, or just a short piece about how the United States, we never ratified the Convention on the Rights of the Child, although we did sign it. We were a signatory. We never actually ratified it. And how our failure to protect the refugee children that have been coming across the U.S. Mexico border has been in my opinion, just a shame and an embarrassment all over the world, and it's caused a large crisis here. I was telling the professor before we were speaking that before my talk that I'm here in Salt Lake City, Utah right now, helping start a refugee clinic because we have a refugee crisis, not just refugees from Ukraine and Afghanistan, Venezuela, but lots of children. My clinic is going to help children. We're going to have a special focus on the children. And so the first thing I have some slides put that we're going to go through. And so we have some different definitions. We have a federal statute called the Immigration and Nationality Act, the INA, and it's defined differently in a couple different places. And it's different what it means to be a child and what it means to be a parent. But the term that's really important when we think about these children is an unaccompanied child. What is an unaccompanied child in our law? That's the second slide that I can see, but I can't advance the slide myself. Could someone advance the slides? The second slide? Great, thank you. So unaccompanied child, it's a term of art in the United States. Unaccompanied alien child. An alien in our law in the United States is just the word that we use for people that are not citizens of the United States. So an unaccompanied alien child is a technical term. It's defined in the law as a child who has no lawful immigration status in the United States, who's under age 18, that's the age of majority here in the United States, and there must be no parent or legal guardian in the United States, and that there's no one able to provide care or physical custody. And so when these children arrive, when these unaccompanied children arrive in the United States, could you please go to the next slide? Thank you. These children, these young migrants, they get special protections under United States law. We have something called the Trafficking Victims Protection Act that was passed probably about 12 years ago, probably a little bit longer. But children who come unaccompanied to the United States, they receive special protections, and I'll talk a little bit about that later. But one of the problems is that we don't define in our laws what an accompanied child is. So sometimes when the children arrive at the border with adults, they may be accompanied by an adult, but unless they're arriving with their parent or their guardian, they're considered unaccompanied. And this segs into what I wrote in my short paper about the zero tolerance immigration policy that we had here in 2018 under President Trump. As I'm sure you are aware, there was a policy here in the United States for a time where migrant children, refugee children, were separated from adults that they were with. So these were children that were accompanied. They were in the custody of their parents or with other adults, but then they were separated from them. So then we were in a situation where we had children who were not unaccompanied minors becoming unaccompanied minors, and the humanitarian disaster that caused, it's hard to understate it. I think now, almost 4 years or more than 4 years out, we see a lot of the residual trauma that these children who have been reunited with their families are continuing to suffer. I teach this when I teach my classes, when I teach immigration law, when I teach my clinic classes. I assign this book. It's called Separated. It's a book by a journalist. It's all about, it's really just a treatise about what happened. And then I also assign this book. This is actually about family detention. It's a very short book. It's called Tell Me How It Ends. And it's about family detention, which is a little bit different, but about children being incarcerated, right? Because when children are unaccompanied, they're also put into custody, government custody, which are very much carcel, they're like jails. So when the Trump administration started separating children as a matter of strategic immigration policy, it became there was a lot of outrage, but in my opinion, there was not enough outrage. But could you go to the next slide, please? Coming from the southern border, most of the children are from Mexico, Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. But we do get children from any country. As I just said, my new clinic here in Salt Lake City, we're going to be serving unaccompanied minors. I have quite a few unaccompanied minors from Afghanistan. So it's not just in Latin America, but the children's fleeing violence families, but children, unaccompanied children coming from Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, the Central American Northern Triangle. That has been the bulk of the people coming. Could you advance to the next slide, please? This is just a little chart showing the unaccompanied migrant children from 2009 to 2015. I couldn't find a good chart that had more recent numbers, but it hasn't changed a whole lot. As you can see, the Northern Triangle is strongly represented, and the highest number on this chart is 70,000. So that's quite a large number of unaccompanied children coming across our borders, and they're from Central America. The next slide. Oops, there's one. There you go. Thanks. Why are these children leaving? They're leaving their home countries. Researchers talk about how the Northern Triangle, there's lots of violence, poverty, family reunification. Of course, lots of families are already here in the United States. But normally I have done a lot of asylum cases for these children, and also other forms of relief for these kids. And it's usually more than one reason. Usually it's poverty, it's gang violence, it's a lot of things. But consistently, gang violence is the primary motivation for fleeing. There was some research done in El Salvador that talked about how child migrants were returned to Mexico because that's where a lot of people who this is before we even had the Title 42 thing going on here in the United States, where migrants are not allowed to come into the United States. They must remain in Mexico. You see that now with Venezuelan refugees must remain in Mexico before they can come to the United States to seek asylum. But 60% of the migrants listed crime, gang threats, and then just general insecurity for leaving. Okay, next slide, please. So this is when I start thinking about, and why I wrote my short paper about, like, what are our obligations under international law? Here again in the U.S., we don't think so much about international law. I think as a just in general, right? About what type, not just we're clearly violating our own domestic law by doing what we are doing, but we are also violating international law, because we entered into treaties, right, with other countries to ensure the protection and safe passage of refugees, including the 1951 Convention relating to the status of refugees, the 1967 Protocol, and this is the non-refoulement, type of treatment, where we will not return an individual to a country where he or she faces persecution from a government or a group, if they are unable or unwilling to return to their country based on an enumerated ground. The normal ones that we always talk about: race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership in a particular social group. And we also are supposed to protect people under the Convention Against Torture, which is the separate treaty. Okay, next slide, please. So we implemented these treaties, various laws, and they are the basis for our refugee and asylum programs. Again, it's supposed to be that anybody can seek asylum. You're supposed to be able to present yourself at the border and seek protection. But as I mentioned, we have some strange interpretations of law right now, where some people have to remain in Mexico before they're allowed to present themselves at the border and seek asylum. So I have argued that in order to meet our international obligations to protect children, we should treat children differently more differently than we already do. They should have adequate representation. Here in the United States, if you are in deportation proceedings, if you're in the United States and you have an asylum claim, you're not going to get a lawyer paid for by the government. You have to have your own lawyer, and that includes children. And so we're in this strange situation sometimes where children have to represent themselves. And so again, this I turn back to the fact that the United States, who was a major drafter of the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, and the fact that we signed the treaty back in 1995, we are the only UN member state that never ratified it. So again, I think that when I think about the horror that happened with the family separation, with these children, unaccompanied children, these vulnerable migrant children being taken away from adults and left on their own, in the system of not just deportation, but also not having the protection of adults in a foreign country, where they're fleeing their home country. It's a pretty dramatic abuse, I think, of power. There had been a case in the United States in the 1980s. It's actually still ongoing. It's called Reno. It was called Reno versus Flores. Now it's called, the name changes every time there's a new Attorney General of the United States. so right now it's Garland versus Flores, the Flores case. And that was supposed to be, the argument there was that the best interest of the child was supposed to be the standard for incarcerating refugee children. And the court actually said that is not the standard that is applicable when you have children in custody. There's no need to have a hearing to determine whether or not the confinement of the children was in their best interest. And actually the standard that the court said was, they said that as long as the institutional custody is good enough, then it's constitutional, which is pretty horrifying to me, right? Good enough, what does that mean? Again, we're talking about children, unaccompanied migrant children who are fleeing, they're refugees, right? So this good enough standard is still in effect. Could you go ahead and show the next slide? I actually spoke about this on a podcast, and I have a link to the podcast in the next slide if anybody wants to listen to it later. It was where I talk about the good enough standard in Flores and how it, I think, really affects our ability here in the U.S. to protect children the way we should be protecting them. Okay, so our presidents, including Barack Obama and our current president Joe Biden, when he was vice president, one of the arguments that they liked to make about why incarcerating refugee children under this good enough standard was not a violation of domestic or international law was because these children were not eligible for asylum, fortunately, or any type of relief. Even though we have, like I said, special protections for unaccompanied children, there is here in the United States this widespread belief that children and families who are fleeing private harms like domestic violence or gang violence are not actually refugees. And so I know this to be false because I've won lots and lots of cases. I have lots and lots of clients who have received asylum fleeing private harm, not the quintessential government act harm. That's not a requirement to receive asylum. It doesn't have to be a state actor. I think that's a big misunderstanding. So what types of protections do children, particularly Central American children coming from the Mexico border, coming across the border, what types of protections do they qualify for under U.S. law? Could you please advance the slide? Oh, this next one, there you go, thank you. So children coming to the U.S., they have, again, like I said, they have international protections. They could also be eligible for humanitarian relief. There's lots of humanitarian reliefs in the United States that the children can receive apart from asylum law. The UNHCR did a survey of 404 unaccompanied children from Central America, and 58% of them have been forcibly displaced because of harms that would qualify for international protection. And this includes, again, trafficking, crime victims, children that have been abused or abandoned by their own parents. And so these things in particular, you see a lot of children who are eligible for that relief. My interest in continuing to work with children is that a lot of these children are eligible for this type of humanitarian relief but don't know it. And so my goal with my clinics is to to locate these children and try to give them some relief, because certainly more children are eligible for relief than are receiving it because they just don't know what is available out there. So so again, this we have this rub where our law actually protects the kids, but there's a gap between getting the kids the relief and the protection that they deserve. And again, back to the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which states that childhood is entitled to special care and assistance, the family as the fundamental group of society and the natural environment for growth and well-being of all its members, and particularly children, should be afforded the necessary protection and assistance so it can fully assume its responsibilities within the community. I mean, I feel like, again, we did not ratify the convention, but we helped draft it and sign it. And as I said, we have the tools in the law to fulfill those obligations and make it a reality. And I would like to see us do that. Could you please show the next slide? So again, there was a survey in 2010 done by the Vera Institute of Justice, which is in New York City. Again, 40% of the children screened in government custody could be eligible for relief from deportation under U.S. laws. I actually think that that's a very low number. I think that probably it's low because of the questions that were asked were not probably, phrased in a way that the children, who again don't have right to counsel, they don't have lawyers necessarily, could understand, and they don't have adults, right? Unaccompanied, they don't have an adult who's looking out for them, their best interests. So I would guess it's a lot more than 40%, but that's the number that I have right now. Again, representing kids is difficult because of their age, right? The complexity of their claims. And then again, the trauma. I can't state enough how hard it is with the trauma that surrounds what's happened to the children, getting them to as an attorney to help them receive the protection that they deserve. And again, back to the fact that they're in a, when they first arrive here, unless they have a sponsor or a substitute family, like a foster family to care for them by the government, they're in a jail-like situation. And so again, back to the Convention on the Rights of the Child, Article 37B of the Convention says that arrest and detention of children should be a measure of last resort. And unfortunately, in the United States, that's not the case. It's actually the first resort. The children are taken into custody, government custody, and kept, in secure facilities until they are released, right? Most of them are actually released. But again, a lot of them are detained for quite a long time, especially if they are detained with their families. And the weird thing about the law is even if a child eventually is reunited with family, they're still considered unaccompanied minors if they came by themselves. So that special protection is supposed to continue, but it doesn't always. So again, I think our government again tries to have it both ways. And again, this is because I believe that we are not enforcing, my argument again being the best interest of the child should always be in the forefront of our minds when we're doing this. Okay, next slide. So what types of things are kids eligible for? Again, asylum. Everybody thinks about asylum, right? International protection based on one of 5 grounds. Here in the United States, the one that I see children getting passed over for all the time, just simply because they don't know this exists, special immigrant juvenile status. It's a really great remedy. It's a humanitarian form of relief for children who are abused or abandoned or neglected by one or both parents. It used to be when it first came about, it was eligible only for children who had been abused or abandoned by or neglected by both parents. But Congress amended that statute in 2014 or maybe 2013, something like that, to make it one parent. So if you've been abused, abandoned, or neglected by at least one parent, and you're from anywhere in the world except for Mexico or, well, no, I think yes, actually you can. The TVPRA doesn't cover Mexican nationals or Canadian nationals, but if you've been abused, abandoned, or neglected, and you're an unaccompanied minor, you can get this relief. You have to be unmarried, you have to be under 21, under 18 based on state law, and you have to have a dependency order issued by a state juvenile court. But once you get those findings of fact from a state court and you file that with the federal immigration system, you get permanent residence, which is an amazing remedy, right? So you can be here and have the opportunity to become a citizen. And again, almost every unaccompanied minor who gets here is almost certainly eligible for this type of relief. They just don't have it because they don't know about it. So that's a really powerful form of relief that we have in our law. Okay, next slide. The other two that I see for unaccompanied kids that are not really utilized to the best of their ability are U visas. So U visas are available in the United States. That's for people that are victims of certain crimes. You have to have suffered substantial physical or mental abuse and cooperate with law enforcement in either the investigation or prosecution of the crime. Again, there's special rules for parents of children as well as children. And then T visas, trafficking victims, severe form of trafficking. Remember, trafficking can be labor trafficking, it can be sex trafficking, it can be all kinds of trafficking. And again, lots of children who would be eligible for SIJS are also eligible for trafficking visas, right? So I've had clients where we've applied for both, because you can apply for both. I mean, so there's lots, and asylum too. So there's lots of options. You have to show that if you were removed, if you were sent back to your harm, you would have extreme hardship or suffer severe harm. But again, that's a pretty, it's a high bar to meet. But when you have the facts that these children have, it can be done, and you can get them the protection that they are entitled to. Okay, next slide, please. So I've mentioned this a couple times, the TVPRA. The TVPRA, again, like I said, is the federal statute. It was, I said it was 10 or 15 years old, just to show how old I am. 2000, it was signed into law, but it's been amended several times. 2008, it was a major amendment, and President George W. Bush had signed it because there were being children that were being apprehended by the Border Patrol on the southern border, and they just were not being adequately screened for protection or relief in the United States. And as I said before, I don't believe that. I think that's still the case, that there's not adequate screening. That might be, lack of resources, almost certainly lack of knowledge of the law. Also, how candid are the children with the people who are trying to screen them. But again, that's another problem you have when you separate children from adults, is their ability to tell their story. The TVPRA was supposed to have procedures to ensure that if unaccompanied children are deported, that they're safely repatriated to their countries of origin. But the first thing that has to happen is that these unaccompanied children must be screened as potential victims of human trafficking. So that really is the first concern, is that we have kids that are being trafficked, and to prevent human trafficking of children across our borders. Okay, next slide, please. Again, so the TVPRA, again, the protections are different for children who come from Canada and Mexico, but every other country in the world has the same procedures. If you're from Mexico or Canada, you end up, you get screened for trafficking anyway, but you do get put into removal proceedings. But if not, you just get sent back to Canada or Mexico. The next slide, please. But everybody else can go into, gets the right to stay and seek some type of relief. Again, we have something called the 1-year filing deadline for asylum here in the United States. The Trafficking Victims Protection Act made it so that children don't have to file it within that time limit. Normally, if you file it within a year of arriving here, your claim is going to be void absent extreme circumstances or changed circumstances. But that's not true if you are a child. Health and Human Services, which again is the administrative agency in charge of refugees here, they are supposed to ensure the language is to the greatest extent practicable that unaccompanied children have counsel. Now, I don't know what they mean by that, because really these kids just don't have counsel. They really don't. I represented a child in my clinic years ago, 2014 or 2015, and they have in Arlington, Virginia, which is outside Washington, they have a special docket for the children. And the day that I went, there were 70 children, and my little girl, was the only kid there with a lawyer, me. So, yeah, I mean, it's not a moneymaker. It's hard to get people to represent children. So I don't know what they're doing to the greatest extent practical to ensure that they have counsel. But right, they're not just supposed to represent them in the legal proceedings, but we have an obligation to prevent them from mistreatment, exploitation, and trafficking. Again, these are all, I think, really lofty goals and theoretically in the best interest of the children, but I don't personally see a lot actually happening to accomplish those goals. Okay, next slide. So how are these unaccompanied children treated once they get here? How are they compared to adults and children arriving in families? So if adults and families, when they're apprehended here in the U.S., they're typically put in deportation proceedings in front of an immigration judge, which means, you may be in detention, but most people are not. They get released and, promise to come back. But if you're at the border, that's not gonna happen, right? If you're an adult, 83% of adults, this is kind of an old statistic, but back in 2013, they were moved through an out-of-court proceeding called expedited removal. We have a federal statute that allows a summary removal process for adults who are encountered within 100 miles of the border, in most cases. And so kids, you can't do that. You can't just summarily turn kids around. The next slide. Please. The kids, right, because of this concern that kids are they're kids, they're being potentially trafficked, unaccompanied kids found on the border, they are initially, like I said, processed and detained, but they can't be turned around and they cannot be sent around like adults are just, adults, like one of the things they call it here in the US is catch and release, like they catch them and they release them. You cannot do that to children because they are children. Again, they are put in standard removal proceedings in immigration court, but they're not in the custody of ICE. They're in the custody of Health and Human Services Office of Refugee Resettlement within 72 hours. And I've had people say to me, why do you call these kids refugees? I'm like, well, they are refugees, right? They're refugees. They are fleeing, and they are actually in the custody of the Office of Refugee Resettlement. So it's not just me making up a word to call them. They are refugees. So they're in the Office of Refugee Resettlement, these children. So they're treated quite differently, and it has to be within 72 hours. I will say they're pretty good about transferring them into custody within 72 hours. Okay, the next slide, please. I already told you guys about Mexico and Canada are treated differently, but if they're kids, right, from those two countries, they can send them right back. They call that voluntary return. So it's not expedited removal, it's just voluntary return, which again, I think is just kind of a language game. But those are separate agreements that we have with Mexico and Canada because they share a border with us. What happens to these kids in custody? The next slide, please. Lots of NGOs work with kids, and they're really concerned that CBP, which is Customs and Border Protection, is not the right agency to be screening children for signs of trauma, abuse, and persecution. And I would agree with that, just based on my own observation of the way CBP does things. A group here called Appleseed, they had a report that stated that CBP generally does not do a great job conducting searching inquiries regarding what danger the children are in, what legal rights they have. And they also expressed a concern that the repatriation agreement we have with Mexican nationals is really just about logistics and not done in ways that are in the best interest of the kids. Okay, the next slide, please. The last thing I'm going to cover before I wrap up is just do the children get attorneys? I already told you my story about my one of 70. They're because they're not given government counsel, right, to represent them in immigration court. That's because here in the U.S., deportation is a civil proceeding; it's not a criminal proceeding. And in our Constitution, you only get an attorney provided by the government if you are in a criminal proceeding. So this is a civil proceeding, and there's no right to counsel. You have the privilege of being represented at no expense to the government. So if you can pay, you can play, but you don't get a lawyer. So that means that you have to find a private lawyer or pro bono counsel, free lawyers. I mean, that's really hard to do. It's really hard to find. Again, the language about the greatest extent possible, making every effort to utilize the services of pro bono counsel. That day I told you about one child out of 70, the judge was begging from the bench. He was saying, all of you who are in here for other matters, I'm begging you, take these kids' cases. It's our responsibility to make sure that they have counsel. I can't speak to how successful those efforts are. My last slide is about, is again kind of an old statistic, but in April 2015, there were 38,000 children pending in immigration court with They were unrepresented without attorneys. They had to appear before an immigration judge by themselves, navigate the immigration court process. They're expected, it sounds ridiculous, but they are expected to put in a legal defense, no representation, and in front of, and their opposing counsel is a trained prosecutor whose job it is to remove them. And that's just the last link that I would show if we had time, but kind of that demonstrates the kind of absurdity of the whole process. So again, my concern nowadays is about how all of this that I just talked about is, because there's no requirement in United States law that we act in the best interest of the child in enacting and enforcing our federal immigration enforcement laws. We need to make a change. There was a law introduced last year in Congress called the U.S. Citizenship Act 2021, among other things. It basically would have codified the best interest of the child standard for immigrant children. It would have prohibited immigration officials from separating children from their parents. It would have, ensured that the due process, or the zero tolerance policy would never happen again. There would be more due process for the kids, and it also would have provided funding for lawyers for children, and also counseling and follow up on the traumatic things that happened to them if they were separated, and also just the fact that they're unaccompanied minors. A lot of bad things happen on the way here. But like a lot of things in our Congress, it got stuck in process and did not pass. But hopefully, maybe in the future, we could, if we keep pointing out that we are not just violating our own laws, but we're also violating international law, we can think seriously about changing the way we do things to work toward enforcing our immigration laws in ways that are in the best interests of children. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Kristina. At least I enjoyed a lot your presentation. There were many aspects of U.S. law that I wasn't aware. It's always something interesting about the U.S. that we have to listen to it more and more in order to get to know all the specifics when it comes to migrants and how the treatment is given by the U.S. government, especially when it comes to differences between adults and children. And there are many differences, right?
Yeah. Lots of differences, but I feel like you said, or I was trying to say, like in practice, it doesn't get executed so well a lot of times.
And it doesn't get executed so well because children sometimes are treated just like adults, right?
Right.
And
Exactly.
I do have some points if we could get to them and maybe listen to you a little bit more.
Yeah.
The first topic that I was wondering if we could talk a little bit more is that you mentioned first that there is a difference between children that come from Canada and Mexico because they have borders with the U.S., and children from these countries would be treated somewhat different than the others, or somehow different from other countries. But I was wondering if there are differences between Canada and Mexico, because we know that a lot of people try to get illegally to the U.S. from the Mexican border, from the southern border. And I'm not aware of many cases from the northern border to the U.S. So I was wondering if there are differences because of numbers, or maybe because there is this idea that there are more people from the south trying to get in than from the north.
Right. I think it's just because we have separate treaties with Canada and Mexico that we agreed, for whatever reason, that we would treat their citizens. And I think it covers not just children, but I think also adults, right? We have, like, for example, we in the United States can't apply, like, we're generally not able to apply for asylum in Canada. I mean, unless something really changes, you can try, but we have agreements where generally we don't. We have safe third country agreements. I think that's with Canada. That's the situation, right? Canada is a safe third country for the U.S. Although I feel like during the Trump years they were going to revoke that status from the U.S. on their part. That U.S. was not a safe third country for Canadians. But I'm not exactly sure. I think it is just the fact that we share these large land borders, and we have contiguous, really large. This idea that we have protected borders. I mean, there are certainly parts of the Mexican border that are militarized, but like you said, Canada, it's largely an unsecured border, and there are large swaths of the Mexican border as well that are very just open, and you can just kind of cross if nobody's paying attention. So I can't answer why exactly that is, but I think it is just because we have separate agreements with them about how we treat their citizens and nationals.
Right. Something else that came to my mind when you were talking, in the beginning, you mentioned there was a difference, of course, when it comes to the Trump administration and how the Trump administration treated especially children, separating them from their families, and that got actually some bad repercussion for the U.S. Mm-hmm. And there was afterwards some tentatives to reunite these children with their families.
Yeah.
But I, at least from my part, I haven't heard much from this tentatives of trying to reunite these families. And from what I heard, there were being some problems when it comes to reuniting because they weren't locating their parents. Mm-hmm. And I was wondering what happened to these cases, and if you could enlighten us a little bit more.
Sure. Yeah, I think, the reporting on that has been sporadic. I think I actually just was reading the other day about a child who was, again, they've been having trouble locating the parents because, again, this book I showed, Separated, is actually really good. It's very recent. It just came out, I think, in 2021. So it has some really updated stuff about how difficult it was to locate the families, the parents that were separated. And also some people had also been, wrongfully deported. And so some people were brought back. I know that there was an instance toward the beginning where there was a plane full of people that had been separated from their kids, and the government was trying to rapidly remove them. And a judge in Washington, D.C. actually had the government turn the plane around because it was in the air on its way, and he issued an order that said, bring them back here. And so I know that, like, it's happening, the reunions are happening, but I don't know. I know that they are, like, kids lost in the system, parents lost in the system, because there just was no good record keeping, because it was just it was so poorly executed on every level. So again, I know there's been lawsuits. I know there's been civil suits. I know there's been, like you said, efforts to locate families. But I can't give you like a concrete update on numbers and stuff. But I know it's still happening. They're still trying to actively reunify families.
Two questions arise from this. I'm sorry. One of them is that if they are not located, if their parents are not located, would they be able to apply from one of those reliefs that you were telling us about?
I mean, I believe it would be a fact-specific circumstance, right? But like, I feel like if I had a child who had been separated from their family and they couldn't be located, gosh, that's such a can of worms. I feel like certainly the children, special immigrant juvenile status, abused, abandoned, or neglected by the parents. I mean, I don't know. I mean, if you're kidnapped, right? I always say, like, they were kidnapped victims. I feel like they could be eligible for a U visa, because to me, those children are crime victims. I don't know how the U.S. government would feel if I submitted an application saying that my child was a kidnapped victim of the U.S. government, my client. But I feel like that's a truthful statement. I mean, I guess that would be a case-by-case basis. I feel like, it's very hard to to get any kind of declaration that a child is an orphan if you can't prove they're actually orphans. So I think there would be no way for them to be eligible for something like adoption, which I think is right. But at the same time, I don't know. I feel like I don't think that, again, this goes back to, I don't think the government has been held accountable for what we did. And I don't think there's any way to remedy the harm. So I'm sorry, I can't answer that question either, but I feel like, can we deport these children? No, I feel like also they're material witnesses in lots of lawsuits. I feel like they would be able to stay for that reason alone. So that's a really great question, but I don't really know the answer.
No problem. No, it's just something that came to my mind.
Yeah.
And the second question that came to my mind when you answered to the previous one was that when we had the elections for the Joe Biden, now current administration, one of the main points was that the American policy would change when it comes to the treatment of migrants.
Mm-hmm.
But in the beginning of Joe Biden's term, people were not seeing any changes, like materially speaking. And afterwards, with the COVID pandemic, all the news were about the pandemic, but I don't know actually how it is now. If there were if this laws or these decrees were passed by the Trump administration actually are not in force anymore, or they're still in force, they're still being revoked, they're still being debated. If you could give us an update on that.
Yeah, it's a huge back and forth. So the Trump administration had enacted something called Title 42, which is a federal law that enabled the U.S. to essentially shut down the borders in times of national crisis. And so at first they said the borders had to be sealed. And this was the Remain in Mexico program, right? Where we were not allowing people to apply for asylum, which is, like I said, not just a violation of domestic law, it's a violation of international law. And they invoked that around the time of COVID when it first started. They're like, we can't let people in because of COVID. It's a national emergency, it's a health emergency. And Biden had said that he was going to revoke Title 42, but then he didn't. And he said he was going to end Remain in Mexico. And then he tried to revoke Remain in Mexico, but then got sued by Texas. Texas is always the state leading these suits, like Arizona maybe too, but definitely Texas, saying that it would harm them as a state for Title 42 to be revoked. And I believe they won at the lower appellate federal courts, but then the Supreme Court, the United States Supreme Court, allowed that to happen. They said, you can go ahead and revoke, stop Remain in Mexico. So Biden stopped Remain in Mexico for a while, but then with Venezuelans, put it back in place very recently, Title 42. But then just like yesterday or the day before, a federal judge struck it down. So, but that'll certainly get overturned by the, so it's back and forth. So yeah, so it's a great question, but it's constantly changing. So, but the short answer is Biden didn't change a lot. It's a lot of the same.
That's so interesting because at least for us, what we heard is that he was elected for some of the immigration policies and got some votes from the migration community because of those, right?
And we had the horrible treatment of Haitian refugees coming up through Mexico, other Black refugees from the Caribbean. The racism coming is just horrible. There's those horrible pictures of like Border Patrol agents on horseback, like whipping Black people. I mean, it's just right. It's very reminiscent of slavery and just the disparate treatment. And then, of course, when the Ukraine situation happened, you would have the long lines of people waiting with Remain in Mexico, and then Ukrainians would be coming right to the front with the special parole. And so, again, that brought up issues of racism and preferential treatment for Europeans versus Latin Americans and Caribbean. So, yeah, you're right. People voted for Biden based on his promises of immigration. But like I said, he was vice president for 8 years, and I had been paying attention to what he'd been saying. And so I was not super hopeful that much would change, and nothing really did.
That's interesting because you just mentioned the Ukrainians getting in the front of the line and Latin Americans, and those people that were in Mexico waiting for their visas, or the caravans and everything that is going on in some of the Central American states, right? So it's very interesting because we hear this discrimination happening in Germany, happening in other European countries, but I guess we at least myself, I didn't hear that from the U.S. as well. So this is very interesting.
Yeah. Oh yeah. It happens. It's very real. It's shameful, especially the treatment of Haitian migrants has been really bad, really terrible. Really, there. I have friends who were working in the Mexican California border, so Tijuana, which is right near San Diego. Yeah, the majority of the people last year, the year before, just stuck in Tijuana were from Haiti and Cameroon, Black people.
That's interesting. Something that also arose from your talk comes from that advisory opinion from the Inter-American Court of Human Rights that Mexico asked the court to address the immigration and the differences between migrants. And Mexico actually asked about the American policy of discriminating undocumented migrants and everything like that. So this decision this advisory opinion from the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, they set a lot of standards when it comes to migration. So they talked about also cremigration and the non-criminalization of migration, the non-detention of children when they are migrating to other countries, and also they touched upon a little bit on the no refoulement principle. And these are standards that, at least in Brazil, we talk a lot because of our new federal law of 2017 that actually got a lot from the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. But I know that the United States is not part of the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. At least it's a part of the Organization of the American States. And I was wondering if Organization of American States and standards set by the Inter-American Commission, if they actually have any impact, or if they are even spoken when it comes to migration law or migration issues in the U.S.
Not by our federal courts, right? I mean, the only people that talk about international law are people like me, like law professors, right? We talk about it because we know, right? We know that like we are part of a global community, and that, again, we have signed international treaties and that we have obligations. We've entered into our own like promises of the way we're going to treat people seeking refuge. I mean, and we are failing miserably at doing that. And so, and then of course, again, refusing to be part of groups like the Inter-American States group. No, the only people that talk about it are law professors. I mean, there are occasionally, I mean, I have a friend in California, Paul Hoffman. He is an international law expert, and he's a law professor too. So he'll get cases in front of the Supreme Court about international law, but he always loses because the Supreme Court always says, you know, this is federal court, right? We don't care about international law. We're not obligated to give importance to that. So sadly, the answer is no. But I continue to teach it to my students because I think that it's important to know what an outlier we are in the global community in terms of respecting international human rights, because human rights aren't just like domestic human rights, they're international. And again, we have availed ourselves of some of those agreements, and we have an obligation, I believe, to be part of the international community and respect those types of opinions. So
yes, I remember a lot of the international law textbooks from the US. When it comes to the domestic law and international law, they also talk about this case where it reminded me of that International Court of Justice case when it comes to the Mexican nationals that were in the death penalty row in Texas.
Yes.
And the International Court of Justice had to halt their execution, and the U.S. continued to carry out that execution because it's federal law. And
it's astounding to me, because if people were executing our citizens like that, I mean, the outrage would be incredible, right? The American exceptionalism is real and deep here. But yeah, I mean, I think, I will say though that the one place that I do see some talk and some recognition given to international laws is in the sphere of the children, right? If you read the asylum officers, so it's weird the way immigration law is set up here. You get federal court review on some things, but not everything. It's mostly just an administrative system. And so immigration law is generally administrative law. And you have people making decisions based on administrative law, not in judicial. They're not judges. They're not even lawyers a lot of times. Right? So the asylum officers, they have a handbook, and it has a lot of really good guidance for how they should make decisions and protect kids who are seeking asylum or other forms of protection. And a great majority of the support for the reasons for the policy for treating children differently, it's all based on international law. So that's where I actually see, like, and of course, every time I write a brief about kids, I'm like, look, you guys in your own policy manuals are giving importance and emphasis on international law. So the federal courts should do it too. But federal courts always like, we don't care about that. But in practice, you'll see them saying this is the international standards for the children. So that's the only place I've ever really seen any type of international law principles taken seriously in immigration law.
It is something, at least, right, to have at least when it comes to the children, as you said, about the maxim concerning the best interest of the child. So
right. And there are groups here that really are working hard. They have a group called the Young Center for Immigrant Children's Rights. That's their whole focus is that movement to get us to a place in the law where we can, because that maxim is in our the Supreme Court here has said, in terms of like domestic and family law, you always have to put forth the best interest of the child. That's always so if in other areas of the law, best interest of the child and children are concerned is the primary concern, why not in immigration and migration law? Why not? So there's a movement. I mean, I'm not totally like, yay, it's going to happen, but you never know. You never know. Stranger things.
That's so interesting, because even though the U.S. did not ratify the 1989 Convention on the Right of the Child, Article 1 of that convention prescribed that principle. So at least we have a tacit implementation of the treaty.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, again, it's something.
And my last comment, and I'm sorry to bomb you with all of these questions.
Okay. I'm enjoying the discussion very much.
When we talk about non-refoulement and returning the children or even any person to a country where their rights and their physical integrity or their psychological integrity is affected, it is a core principle of international refugee law prescribed under even the 1951 Geneva Convention. And you mentioned the 1951 Convention and the 1967 Protocol. And I was wondering if the non-refoulement principle has been around in decisions as well, or has been mentioned in decisions when it comes to especially children. Like we should not return, not only because of the best interest of the children, but also because of this non-refoulement maxim. Not so sure if that happens. Yeah, we have that. We call it withholding of removal. That's the English version of non-refoulement. It's exactly the same idea, right? That if your life or freedom would be in danger in your country of origin, we will not send you back. And so, I've litigated a lot of those cases. In fact, a lot of my clients from Central America are only eligible for non-refoulement because if you've come here before and been deported, you're generally not eligible for asylum.
But if you come back and you can show by a preponderance of the evidence, so it's a super high evidentiary standard, but if you can show that your life or freedom is in danger, we will not return you under domestic law. But the language is exactly the same as in the convention. So again, that's something that you need a lawyer for, right? Because people don't know about it. Like, I mean, my clients that have gotten non-refoulement, they are mostly women who came from Central America, who came from horribly abusive domestic violence situations, didn't know that that was something they could seek protection for. And then at the end of the day, we were able to get them withholding of removal, non-refoulement. So yeah, we won't send you back. But it's something you have to get from a judge, and you really need a lawyer for that. So you can get it, but it's not easy.
But even if we get that, that would actually make you apply for one of those special visas, right? So would that be granted by the court? Would say, okay, you can stay, so you may apply for this visa, or
so the way it works is, so if you get withholding of removal, you actually have a removal order, they just won't enforce it, right? You're able to stay as long as your situation continues. And if you have withholding or non-refoulement, that's pretty much, it's like being in purgatory. You're here, you have permission to stay, they cannot send you back. You have permission to work, but you don't have any real legal status, right? You have the right, and that's it. Could you change your status? Like, for example, I have a client right now, actually, who has had withholding removal since 2016. She was recently the victim of a crime, and I'm trying to get her a U visa. We would have to have her removal order reopened and vacated. But if she's able to get the U visa, she can adjust her status through other means. So yeah, so technically, yeah, if you can adjust your status through a different means, if you were, for example, a trafficking victim and you got a T visa, later, if you were a crime victim, if you married a U.S. citizen, maybe, there's all kinds of, like, that becomes very procedurally complicated. But most of the time, non-refoulement withholding removal is just the right to remain, and that's it.
So that involves not only a judicial petition that you would have to have it reopened, or would that be all in an administrative area? Mixing both. You would have to get the U from the administrative body, and then you'd have to have your case reopened by a judge and vacated. Like, I had a client who he was actually in proceedings to be removed. He wasn't actually removed yet. We had an asylum case pending. I was able to get him a U visa. I had them reopen and close his deportation, and now he has his green card through the U. So that it's a totally complicated procedural system. So interesting, because we have some administrative issues too here in Brazil. And when we study it, it becomes very interesting, because, there are so many steps or so many procedures that we have to know and go through. And then at least we can see that Brazil is not the only country that has all these problems when it comes to asking for an authorization to stay. So
right. Yeah, it's super complicated everywhere.
So interesting. So, Professor Kristina, thank you very much for your talk, for your presentation, and for this Q&A.
Thank you.
This bombing of questions.
No, it was fantastic. It was so great talking to you. I love talking to people who know about this stuff, because most people's eyes just kind of glaze over when I talk about it. So it was really great to be able to talk to you about it.
Oh, it was great as well. And this is our last panel from this symposium. So we're the closing panelist.
That's great.
Thank you very much for your availability, for taking your time to talk to us a little bit more about the U.S. law, which is always intriguing for me and for all of our students who study these procedures to understand how the U.S. treats migrants, and what are the efforts, at least, that are ongoing within the country in order to get some relief. And you brought us some great points from the inside. So thank you very much.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for inviting me. I hope someday I can see you guys. And I'm sorry for not being able to speak Portuguese. I learned Spanish instead. But thank you.
No problem. Next time, let's do it in Spanish then. And you were more than invited to come to Berlândia. We have actually to arrange that for you to come and maybe teach us a little bit more about American immigration law and everything.
That would be wonderful. Thank you again so much. Appreciate it.
So thank you. Girls, I'm not sure if you want to say anything else from the organization committee about tomorrow.
Hello, I think we can end. I want to thank you, Professor Kristina. It was a pleasure to meet you, and I hope we can meet you in person in the future.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I hope to meet you as well.
Thank you. That's it.
Bye.
Bye.
Good night. Bye. Thank you guys. Good night.